Welcome. I see a couple of people have joined us, and I see people trickling in. So, welcome to this summit session. Coming to the end of our fourth day here. The session, just so you know you're in the right place, is a conversation with advocates from across Washington State. And I think we'll get started at 4:02 to give people a little bit of time to get situated in the space. So again, welcome. I want to encourage you all to start posting in the chat to say hi, where you're calling in from. Yeah, excited to have you all with us. I see the panelists dancing. It's that time of day. Maybe it was just Robert. Okay, keep dancing, Robert. I love it. Okay, so 4:02. So like I promised, oops. Let's get going. I want to start by welcoming everyone to the Washington Bike Walk and Roll Summit presented by Amazon. I'm Vicky Clark. I'm the policy director with Cascade and Washington Bikes. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm really excited to have over 600 registrants for this 5-day virtual event. We'd like to start by starting with a land acknowledgement. This summit is virtual and those participating are joining us from many lands. We acknowledge the land Cascade Bicycle Club sits on today as the traditional home of the Duwamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and Suquamish tribal nations. If you don't know whose lands you're on, look in the chat in a minute where you'll find a link to a map you can use to look up your place on the land. Without them, we would not have access to this environment, and we take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land who are still here. And then I'd also like to note that we are recording this session along with all of the other sessions, and we'll have the recordings available following the summit. The summit, as you all probably know by now, is hosted by Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes. We're two sister statewide organizations with a shared vision of bicycling for all. Cascade serves bike riders of all ages and abilities throughout Washington State, educating new riders, advocating for safe places to bike, and holding events and rides. Washington Bikes advocates for bicyclist rights, endorses political candidates, holds officials accountable, and works to shape policies that will make bicycling safe and accessible for all. And so we want to take a moment to thank our sponsors whose collective contributions have enabled us to bring together 15 panels over these 5 days with expert speakers and registration free for all attendees. Thanks to Amazon, our presenting sponsor. We also thank our supporting sponsors, the Washington State Department of Transportation Active Transportation Division and Eastern Washington Region. Thanks also to our general sponsors, the U.S. Department of Transportation, Federal Highways Administration, and Stacey Bain Bike Lawyers. And so with that, and before we transition to the panel itself, I want to take a second to not skip forward like that, to share our community norms. And excuse me, and take a moment to articulate our community expectations we have for all of the summit sessions. So we will maintain a standard of conduct to ensure that all participants feel safe and respected. We believe every person has the right to be treated with dignity and respect and to be free from all forms of harassment. We ask all of our attendees to be fully present in this session, be self-responsible and self-challenging, listen and process, suspend judgment of yourself and others, and use respectful language towards each other and everyone on the panel. And so I want to quickly introduce the session. Here we go. And I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves in a second, since they can they can do that better than I could ever do justice of that. But this session brings together advocates from around Washington State to discuss the unique, overlapping and intersecting challenges and opportunities that communities face. These leaders will speak to the successes and challenges that come with community-based work and advocacy initiatives. Local advocates are joined by Ken McLeod from the League of American Bicyclists to discuss how this local work can benefit from building a coalition across the state and beyond, and how we can make Washington a great place for people who walk, bike, and roll no matter where they live. So quickly, the format is me doing the introduction, which I'm pretty much done with, and then really a lot of time for panel discussion and audience questions and answers. I really want to encourage folks to, from the get-go, be adding your questions into the chat, where our chat moderators will aggregate them. And yeah, I think that's about it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point, and I want to kick it over to the panelists. So first I want to start with Peter. Peter, who are you? Tell us about you. But you're muted. You should unmute.
Sorry about that. I got the cart before the horse. You can hear me now?
Yes.
So yeah, my name is Peter Van Tilburg. I'm the executive director of Bike Clark County. We're a nonprofit here located in Vancouver, Washington. We have community programs, community partners, and we also have a bike shop. So I kind of like to say we're kind of a hybrid of Cascade, Washington Wild Bikes, and Bike Works in Seattle, if you're familiar with Bike Works. And just a few slides about our programs. We have bike summer camps, which sell out every year. We're partnered with the City of Vancouver Parks and Recreation, as well as the National Park Service, so a federal agency that we're partnered with that allows us to use their land to hold our bike camps on, with tours of, say, the Fort Vancouver and various other places there. Our second program is our middle school safety program. So we partner with various school districts that are outside of in the Vancouver area, and basically help run the safe routes to schools. We provide a fleet of bikes. We tune up the bikes for the school district. We donate all the helmets for the kids to that program. And I'm kind of flying through here because I know time's limited. And our flagship program is our high school bike to leadership program. This was funded through public health, Clark County Public Health Department, and it's an 8-week-long session for high school kids. And it's more than just teaching them bike skills. It's life skills. A lot of these kids are come from minorities background, disadvantaged youth, and that's our bike to leadership program. And most of our programs were shelved during COVID, obviously. However, our bike to leadership, we ramped it up with just 3 kids, so a very small session. And here's our bike shop where I'm sitting currently. We have an agreement with the City of Vancouver to tune up all their police department bikes, and then just all walks of life use our community workbenches. And that's all I have, just a list of all of our partners. That's a 60-slide presentation condensed into 3 or 4.
That's impressive. Thanks for that, Peter. Okay, I'm going to kick it over to Jessica.
Hello. Sharing my screen. All right, so I'm Jessica Engelman. I am founder and current chair of SpokAT here in Spokane, Washington, on the Far East Side. And the origin of SpokAT is that prior to living in Spokane, I was in Portland for a few years and got really into bicycle and active transportation advocacy there. So when I moved to Spokane in late 2018, the first question I asked myself was, all right, where are my people? Who can I connect with? And I was disappointed to find that there were not many groups. So I was encouraged by a city council member to start my own. And we've grown wonderfully. We're entirely grassroots, all volunteer, not even a registered nonprofit. But what I found is in a small city like Spokane, a smaller city like Spokane, that's more than enough. So here is a photo of a recent cycling tour we took of Spokane's very first greenway on Cincinnati. So for those of you who've never been to Spokane before, we actually have really good walking and biking in certain areas. So for instance, we have an amazing trail system. So here's the Centennial Trail on a recent Thursday night ride. And we have a number of official committees and group bike rides, online communities. So this is actually a really interesting place to be an advocate, I think. So we deal with a lot of the same issues that people deal with all across the country, including poor street maintenance and familiar issues with painted door zone bike lanes. We also have some slightly more unique problems. Spokane has a lot of very low income neighborhoods. I believe 4 of the top 10 lowest income zip codes in the state of Washington are located in Spokane, including number 1. I happen to live in number 7, 992. And so this is the photo on the left is actually a sidewalk in one of our wealthier neighborhoods, believe it or not. And the sidewalk on the right is in my neighborhood of 99207. As you can see, not only is the sidewalk unprotected from a street that gets about, if I remember correctly, it's about 40,000 vehicles per day. There's no curb cut, and the sidewalk doesn't even continue off to the side street. Probably our biggest issue is in crossing streets. So this is a major arterial street. It's actually a bus stop. If you look to the left-hand side, there's a bus stop marker. And this was a photo that I just happened to snap while I was trying to cross the street myself. And this is a very common situation where drivers will not stop for you, which is a problem because often there can be very long gaps between safe signalized crossings. But one thing that Spokane does have going for it is we have a pretty good grid of quiet side streets that people already use to walk and bike on. This is Pittsburgh in, if I remember correctly, in Northeast Spokane. And everybody is already using these streets to walk and cycle because, as we've seen, this is what our arterial streets look like for the most part. But the problem is that if you don't live in a neighborhood, you may not know what these streets are. So for somebody who's trying to start off walking or biking for transportation, it can be very intimidating because our official maps send you to streets like this and not to streets like this. So SpokAT has been working on a low stress bike routes map that's entirely crowdsourced. Of routes that people around Spokane use themselves. We're hoping that people can use this for walking as well. The idea being that if it's a good street to bike on, it's probably a good street or at least a better street to walk on as well. So this is a work in progress that was inspired by Denver's Bike Streets map. So all of the streets are color coded based on level of comfort. And we hope to have a official version 1 rolled out soon. So that's SpokAT.
And I guess I have a quick follow-up. So do you do bike and walk advocacy? Is that right?
We are active transportation advocacy. So walking, biking, public transit. But my philosophy as lead of the group is to let the group follow whatever the passion of our membership is. And it's been a lot of bike related projects, but in Spokane, a lot of the bike problems are also walking problems, which means they're access to transit problems. So most of our projects end up being multimodal.
Got it. Okay, thanks. Robert, who are you?
Hello, thank you. Let me just pull this up really fast here and figure out how to make PowerPoint do. There we go. So my name is Robert Getch. I use he, him pronouns. If you ever run into me on the street, I'm deaf on the left side, so tap my shoulder or scream at me loudly. I will not hear you, genuinely, if you are on my left side and I'm not looking for you. So I chair a group called Beacon Hill Safe Streets. We have a much more narrow focus in some ways compared to the groups that spoke previous who are either doing all of Vancouver or all of Spokane. We focus at a neighborhood level, advocating for safe, accessible walk, bike, and transit, and including driving sometimes, surprising people. We do actually sometimes advocate for safety improvements for drivers, particularly if they correspond with other improvements as well. We are focused very specifically on our neighborhood. We work in this area largely. Of course, we do support citywide initiatives and have a passion for those as well, because we know that it's not just about getting to our neighborhood or out of it, it's to get everywhere in the city. And Beacon Hill Safe Streets has been in operation since 2010. and had a brief hiatus after completing a pretty signature project for the group, but is back and operating. And I think I've been the chair since like 2015 or something. I don't know, maybe 16. So just kind of talking about our structure, and I think what makes us really unique, as fast as I can, is that Beacon Hill Safe Streets works as a coalition. We're in a citywide coalition, and on the left side there, you'll see a map of all the other groups in the city that are just like us in a way, though we are the oldest, and maybe not West Seattle, but we're pretty old in this list. We work with Seattle Neighborhood Greenways, which some of you may have seen or attended presentations from or heard about, and they kind of coalesce the city together of all these neighborhood grassroots groups, and then we kind of guide them on what to do to focus on larger goals and projects. And we're also able to help them by donating to the central group that has paid staff to do the work full time. Each group in the Seattle Neighborhood Greenway structures carries a vote for its area. And my last slide is that one thing we also value extremely highly in our neighborhood efforts is being in partnership with other groups, organizations, and things that are, I don't know, anyway, community. So we partner with other groups like Transit Riders Union, the Beacon Hill Business Alliance, which can be unusual for a lot of people, and including the Beacon Hill Council. We also try to be transparent. We post our letters to the web, but we tell people what our intentions are, but how we would like to work with them to meet their needs as well. And we also endorse things that sometimes go outside of the realm of just biking, walking, or transit in some ways. But we, have endorsed things like transit tax renewals. The Seattle Green New Deal is something we had endorsed. We've made comments on or supported and signed on to letters from the NAACP. We've pushed for progressive revenue over budget cuts. So we do also take a big consideration is in partnership with other groups is making sure that we're supporting their efforts if we want them to support our efforts. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Vicky so the last intro can happen, if I can figure out how to stop sharing.
Thanks, Robert. I really like the Greenways model. It's really neat and super effective. Okay, going from like neighborhood scale all the way up to national, Ken. You're like a pro screen sharer, by the way. That was so fast. You've done this before. Oh, but you are muted.
It took me a while to get the unmute. I shared too quickly before I unmuted. Not quite pro. But I am the policy director for the League of American Bicyclists. We're a national organization. We're a membership organization. So we have individual members, we have advocacy group members, around 350 throughout the country. We have bicycle clubs that are members as clubs, I think around 600. And so we are based in Washington, D.C., and our primary focus is working at the federal level. We also work at the state and local level through our Bicycle Friendly America program. So Washington State has been our #1 bicycle friendly state every single time we have ranked states since we started that program in 2008. Our last ranking was in 2019, which seems like forever ago. And we'll probably have another ranking next year is the plan, doing it every other year. Safe Routes does state report cards. They did some this year, so we kind of alternate years. Washington State is a great state for biking. I grew up in the Totem Lake area. I walked to school as a kid and biked to school when I got to more the middle school time. And I think what really stands out about Washington is how much they are taking action to improve biking across the board. There's a lot of states where you might see legislation that's good or like one funding program that's really good. But Washington State seems to have political leadership at the DOT, at the governor, and in the legislature that are all interested, if not fully committed, to making Washington a great state for biking, which, obviously me saying this makes all of your jobs harder because you can't use your state being worse than other states to motivate your legislators or governors or other decision makers. But you guys are really pushing the envelope, and we want you to do that. And we want you to just keep doing the great work that you are doing. Yeah, I'm excited to have this conversation. You can find me online at my Twitter handle, and excited to talk to all of you tonight.
And I think we have other things that we can complain to our electeds about other than not being number 2. So I think we're okay, but it is cool being number 1. Everyone loves winning. I love winning. Okay, thanks for those intros. I think that's really good to just kind of set the scene around different scale orgs, how people are working differently across the state and different communities. And so I guess jumping into some questions, I guess I want to ask, what are some of the challenges that you face in this work, and I think especially right now, right? We've got COVID, we've got wildfires. How are you responding to some of those challenges? And how has your work changed in response? And I'll just open up to anyone just to make it more confusing.
I'll start. You know, one of the first things that really affected our work was going remote. We had our National Bike Summit planned for March, and made the call to make it virtual a week before it was supposed to happen in person. I'm very glad we made that call. I'm very glad to have all the virtual connections that have happened since then. As a national organization, it's actually been great to have so much happening online and virtually, meeting people and talking to people that you might not get to talk to otherwise. So I think that's been one positive thing.
It's maybe a 2-part question. I'll jump in here, but I'm going to set aside COVID for now and just say some of the historic challenges we have are, say, like, is improving bike infrastructure in our city. For example, removing parking to add in a bike lane or something of that nature. And I think what happens, or what I've seen personally happen, in my opinion, is that sometimes the angrier minority voices drowned out the passive pro voices in our community. And I always like to say, like, I'm a cyclist, but I'm also drive an automobile. So it's not us versus them. We're all the same. We're all together in this. So that's 2 cents. And maybe I'll throw it out to the panelists too, if there's other people out there that have challenges that they face in their own communities along those lines.
I think one challenge that I'm seeing in Spokane that I was not seeing in a bigger city like Portland was a definite lack of resources and education by comparison. So anyone who's in the Seattle area or the Portland area or any of those cities, you are spoiled because you have a lot of staff resources that we don't really have. I mean, shortly after I moved here, Spokane hired a bike ped coordinator, which is amazing, but they didn't even have somebody just in charge of that before then. And so what I end up finding is in the advocacy realm, a lot of people who are really up on this stuff, you know, they have Twitter feeds that they follow and Facebook groups, and they read lots of articles, or maybe they come from a planning background. They'll be able to talk about things in a way that we have to be very careful not to alienate other members, because it's really easy to start talking in jargon and acronyms. And, you know, I also do a lot of land use planning and such. So, you know, so maybe this is a good example is, you know, I'll start talking about whether it's better to use an FAR when judging the density of the RSF versus if it's better to focus on units like they do in the or they used to do in the R1 to R5 zone in Portland. If that sentence made no sense to you, that's what it's like for a lot of people trying to enter the transportation advocacy world. When we start talking about, you know, protected bike lanes and greenways and, you know, how is that different from a bike boulevard? Wait, what's a cycle track? I thought a cycle track was a protected bike lane, you know, and so I think that's something that, you know, that's enough that we're dealing with in the advocacy world. And then when we try to go out to the neighborhood councils to do, you know, outreach outside of transportation, it's just that one more step. And one particular difficulty that we have in Spokane is a lot of people are very excited for world-class treatments like protected bike lanes, like greenways. And we don't have any examples here in Spokane that we can point to. We literally only finished our first greenway about a month ago, and it's a very atypical example because they're also putting a bus rapid transit line on it. So there's a lot of misconceptions and confusion in the general public as well as in the advocacy world that I think is a major challenge.
Yeah, and I would just kind of follow. I think one thing I would say is that outreach and connecting with people who are not just in it because they're here right now watching this presentation probably is difficult. It's a consistent problem with many groups that I've heard and spoke with. It's a consistent problem here in Seattle. You know, and one of the hardest parts is trying to find ways to get to people and get their feedback, because you're right. If people dislike something, they'll be loud and boisterous. And if people like something, they might also be loud, but if you're in the middle, you might say nothing at all. And we find that's probably the most common case, even though the people in the middle have plenty of opinions about what they think should be done, how it should look, and what they think the future should look like. So getting to those folks is really challenging. We've been trying to do that through partnership. I will say during this struggle with like COVID, for example, I know our group had done, work to try to still support Stay Healthy Streets by using appropriate social distancing and still talking with neighbors. I know our sister group, Seattle Neighborhood Greenways, actually did an entire effort to put door knockers, or the little hangers for doorknobs, across the entire network that they built out in the COVID response. The other thing I'd really just quickly note on too is that it's true that it can be inaccessible and very jargon driven to join these groups. And I just want to show, and I'm going to take over the whole screen for like 2 seconds and just show you our letter that we recently sent like 2 weeks ago to the city to explain something. And if you take a good note, one of the reasons that we use this emoji scale thing to try to convey what we're getting at here, other than being very adorable, is also trying to make it make sense to the other community partners in which are trying to partner with us on this letter and get their concerns about issues they see with driveways and daycares and the schools acknowledged. And in part of this, while also trying not to make it a 30-page letter that says exactly what we think they should do or should not do, because it's not where the community is currently at. So that's some of the ways that we've kind of been going through that, and I'll stop sharing. So, but I had that up because I wondered if it would come up, and that's perfect.
That was cool. That was like a grad school presentation of the thing. Like, I would give you an A+ Robert, for that. So thanks each of you for that. I think you really started to touch on inclusion and getting beyond the choir. And so I guess I want to ask you, what does that look like in terms of building support for your work, and what are some strategies that you found that work in sort of broadening beyond the traditional base? A lot of the conversations that we've been having this week have been about racial equity and really the bike community being pretty white. Quite white, very white. And so, yeah, I'm interested to hear how, that's my question. There we go. And again, open to everyone, just for maximum confusion.
I can address that quickly from Clark County's perspective. As just recently in the past year, we've created a DEI, Diversity, Equity, Inclusivity Committee within our board, which has helped us move forward along those lines. And also we've tried to diversify our board. But more importantly, I think when we've partnered with bike clubs like the Vancouver Bike Club, the City of Vancouver, Public Health, there's other agencies out there that we partner with, but they would send our message out. So rather than our message and newsletter going out to all our, I think we have 800 individuals on our newsletter. Well, then if it goes out to the City of Vancouver's or Parks and Rec's newsletter, it's really branching out to a much more diverse audience. And it brings in a diverse individuals to our programs through that outreach. I'll mute.
So I think one thing too, so I will just say Beacon Hill, for those of you, they're a white dude representing one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the city of Seattle. And so I think Vicky kind of points to there is a bit of an issue with a lot of bike advocacy in that there is a lot of white folks in it. Just a lot of them. A lot of men too. But I will say Seattle Neighborhood Greenways is decent on that. But I think one of the ways that we've been focusing on trying to build out a bigger umbrella is by trying to go back to some basics. Is trying to figure out, okay, what is the community's needs in these areas? Working with other organizations, with businesses, with residents to explain things, to explain how, and I think one of the key things that we like to point out is that we have issues today. Very few people, if you were to just stop them and say, are your streets doing great? How do you like traffic? Is gonna be like, everything's fantastic here and I love it. They have plenty of things they would probably tell you about how bad the dot is, how bad the traffic is here, how bad cycling is here, and how bad it is to cross the street here. And so one of the things we'd like to try to do is show that these projects can do more than they may look. And yes, they may constrict like a lane space, but they may also provide more opportunities for pedestrian safety, and we can keep parking and do more and facilitate solutions to at least some of the problems. The last thing I'll say is the other key has been working with organizations that are led by people of color, including BIPOC folks in particular, has been a big key for us, supporting initiatives that they are on, even if we don't necessarily get their sign on to our exact plan, is making sure that we're communicating with them, showing them what we think is the value there, but also working to support their efforts and building a relationship that is a two-way street, that isn't I send you stuff and I expect you to support it and I don't do anything to help you. It is we are working on this together, and we are working on different issues that may be almost entirely unrelated to what seems like transportation or cycling, but trying to kind of layer in how they all flow together, maybe.
Jessica, do you want to chime in here? No pressure.
I think when it comes to diversity in groups, there's really a lot you need to look at. Part of it has to do with what does your city look like? So Spokane is a little different from other cities in that we are not just very white, we are very, very white. And we don't have a lot of the same ethnic enclaves that other cities have. We do, but there's still, it's more like instead of being 1% Black or, Native, it's 4%, which creates a very different dynamic. And so that's a really interesting comparison of different cities. And then, of course, there's, all of the other different groups that are important to include, such as people with disabilities, families, people who are older, people who are younger, people who are low income. It really does change the game a lot when you have an advocacy group of people who, all bike or walk most of the time, but they all also own cars, versus a group where you have people who do not have a car because of a disability, because of income preference. And I think that's one way in which I've been very pleasantly surprised by SpokAT is that we've managed to gather a group that represents not only different neighborhoods around the city, but a lot of different backgrounds and experiences with cycling, and it's really, or walking or taking the bus. And it's really been wonderful. For example, having somebody at the meetings who will say, I'm legally blind. Here's my experience biking around our streets.
And one thing, just to kind of, Jessica, I think you made a really great point. And one of the things I just want to build on too, is it's really important to define diversity, I think, when you're talking about it, because diversity means anything. Like, we are diverse in shirt colors on this conference call, if you noticed, though mine and Ken's are a little the same. But generally speaking, I like that. But generally speaking, I think that's really crucial because there's racial diversity, there's diversity in disabilities, and a lot of things. So I think it's really clear, you want to be clear when you're working on that. Our group has a big issue with racial diversity. It's very white. We have, women, we have lots of sexual orientation differences. You have disability differences, but it's still, in terms of diversity, I mean, you could say we're fine, look at all the stuff we have, but in terms of racial diversity, we don't match our community that we're serving. And the other really quick note I would kind of add to that is I think one thing that we also particularly do as a group is, even though we know that there is a vast amount of different demographics around the city, it's still important to look at the impact of the decisions that are being made. And in general, in a lot of cases, low-income folks and other subgroups like people of color, certain immigrant groups, end up being impacted by some of these decisions much more heavily than other groups. And so in my opinion, in some cases, it's important to really seek that out, even if you're in an environment that's largely white, because you will miss something if you don't seek out that input from those groups of folks. And so that's something that we've tried to do and focus on. And I know other groups do as well. I'm losing my voice suddenly.
Yeah, as a national group, we have slightly different issues, but I really feel like we struggle in two directions. One is finding national partners that are diverse and that represent diverse people and work on diverse issues, which I think some of our partnership with public health groups has been extremely helpful in learning about more issues and working with more diverse groups. And then making sure that our grassroots and that those relationships also represent more diverse people is another challenge that we continue to work at and hope that we improve on.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit. So I've heard a lot about sort of collaboration in terms of like intersectional collaboration, whether it's public health or business districts. And I also, working in this space, know that there's like so much more to do than there is time, right? And so we're all really limited in our resources. And so I just want to sort of get into this conversation around like geographic collaboration. Like, what could that look like? How can I think the Seattle Neighborhood Greenways model sort of, it is, speaks to this a little bit. It's like, okay, so you have neighborhoods that then scale up to the city, but given that most of our transportation funding, which is really sorely lacking, comes from state, comes from federal, and so and then there's like a whole regional piece too, since a street doesn't end at the Seattle city limits, right? And so what are some, I guess, as you think about geographic collaboration, what are some of the ways that you do work across geographic boundaries and political boundaries, I would say, and I think the other piece is like, what are the opportunities there? I think that we as two statewide organizations kind of struggle with too, around like how do we support these how do we support more local efforts who are just inherently better suited to be the boots on the ground, if you will. That was a big question. Whoever wants to answer.
I'll go first. So one issue that I think we have a lot in Spokane is trying to reinvent the wheel, which oftentimes is not necessary because other cities have already experimented with a lot of the things that we want to do, and there's no reason why we can't steal their good ideas and avoid their missteps. And part of that problem gets back to that original issue that I talked about of education, staff resources, that sort of thing, is that I'm the kind of person who will spend 2 hours a day on Twitter, on Facebook, reading articles, keeping up with the latest and greatest. And that is an absolutely insane expectation for most advocates. And so what ends up happening is I end up spending so much of my time trying to keep up with what's best that it's difficult for me to then pull back and say, okay, based on all of this research I've done, how do I apply it to my own city? And one thing that would help a lot is if some of the organizations or the cities or groups that have more resources or have been those trailblazers, and they were the ones inventing the wheel in the first place, could come up with toolkits that could then be shared to some of the smaller communities, cities, and organizations to say, here, we went ahead and we came up with anything, a greenway standards plan, a parking management, platter of options. During COVID, there was a lot of, the early days of COVID, there was a lot of creative ideas coming about, and NACTO came out with a whole bunch of useful guides. Because what ends up happening is I find myself hearing from my membership that street maintenance in winter is a huge problem. And I have to then, and I say I as in kind of the royal I, if it works that way. We have to then go out and, do all of this research, find out who's doing what in different places. Does it work? Was this a failed proposal? And then you have to compile it all, write a paper. And then, it's next thing you know, I've put more work into this document than I put into my honors thesis back in college. So, which again, we're not getting paid. So that's a bit much to ask of most people. So it would be amazing if we could have all of these different toolkits that say, you want to suggest putting a protected bike lane in a street in your city. That's great. Here's, exactly what you need to go forth to your mayor, to city council, the city manager, whomever is the decision maker. And here's all of the evidence. You want to get rid of your bike helmet mandate? Great. Here's all the research. Here are the talking points. Here's exactly what you need to say. Here's maybe some things that you shouldn't mention because it sets people off. All of those lessons that other organizations have learned through trial and error would be great to be able to pass on, so that we're not constantly having to do all of this redundant work in a space when we're all constantly tapped out in terms of our bandwidth.
That's great.
I was just going to kind of, I think you're right. Like, our group is a smaller group as well. It's all volunteer efforts. There's a lot of people writing letters together on Google Docs and trying to throw together a grant proposal and hand drawing on maps of schematics of what we think the street might look like. And it is time consuming and it is difficult. And I think one of the things that I think about when I think of the rest of the state and the struggles with advocacy is I think that there may be some base level things we need to have at a state level to assist these programs in getting out. I think a great example of that is that the city of Seattle does have a good department of transportation with many folks who work on bike and walk projects now. That wasn't always the case. I will say, as knowing the history of our group, we'll actually fundraise to send their engineers down to Portland so that they could look at a greenway and figure out what it was and how it works. Like, that was something our groups had to do. So it wasn't always there. And I think problematically is, yes, one local area might bite and win. And, we have a levy that was passed that had a robust amount of bike and walk projects in it, which really helped secure those positions. But on a statewide level, I mean, it seems almost inappropriate that every region or city doesn't have someone trying to figure out and focusing on those as an issue with authority. Similarly, I think that certain policies make it easy to kibosh pedestrian and cycling and transit safety improvements. In general, engineers focus on things like level of service, and they'll say, well, we can't do anything because a car will wait slightly too long, and everything else goes out the window. And, and I know we have certain policies like Complete Streets, which is a lovely policy, but it has virtually no teeth. They can just write on it that, like, we noticed there's no bike lane. Okay, we did it, like, checklist done. But there's no teeth, right? You can't actually get them to now do it. So I think certain areas like that, where we could look at policies that really need to be adjusted, so that, not necessarily saying mandate bike lanes everywhere, but that there is a plan, and in certain corridors they must go in, and we have to figure out how to make it work, versus saying, well, it's hard, so throw it out.
That's excellent points, Robert. I'm just going to throw out one information I heard earlier this week in one of the webinars, was that they're looking at the bicycle rather than just as a mode of transportation or an alternate mode of transportation. It's a solution to the problem out there. And as the cities get more and more congested. And I will also mention that the upside maybe of COVID is, we all know, we've seen more and more people cycling. So somebody getting out of their car, cycling for the first time, they realize the vulnerability of the road users. And so hopefully it'll spawn a movement in our society.
Yeah, sometimes as a national group, I think of some of the work we do as trying to make the slope of the hill that you're pushing the boulder up slightly less steep. You know, hopefully we're working on better federal and state policies that make all of your jobs that much easier. I think because of the way that public funding flows from the federal government to the states, if we can get a big policy win that makes states take biking and walking and transit more seriously. There's a number of states that don't like spend anything on transit. That's hopefully going to build that capacity that makes all of these things easier for you. And I think that's our primary approach to trying to give tools to you. We also have our Bicycle Friendly America programs, but hopefully that public funding is ultimately what's going to change your streets at the end of the day.
Like trickle down. But yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it's everyone has a little part to play, right? And each piece like chips away. Okay, I'm gonna ask another.
Just really quick follow up
Yeah.
to Ken. To the one nice thing I've also seen in your comment is like a place like City of Portland. They had a better NATO. It was a riverfront road that during the summer months they make it a bikeway on one of the lanes, and now it's permanent. It was unanimously voted as a permanent bike lane. I've seen it in Boston and elsewhere throughout the country, which is really nice to see that these temporary bike infrastructures are now becoming permanent.
And that's an interesting one that you brought up, because living in Portland, I'm very familiar with Better NATO, and I really would love to see more pop-up infrastructure here in Spokane, more experimenting. It has a lot of political support. The problem is, where do we get the money for it? And I was a little shocked at, it's like, well, what do you mean, where do we get the money for it? You can do this on a shoestring budget. You just use whatever materials you already have. And the city, whenever I talk to city staff about this, they just look at me and be like, we don't have any materials we can use. We'd have to go out and get new materials, and we don't have the money to purchase those. So it really can vary tremendously from jurisdiction to jurisdiction in terms of what resources are available. And that's something that's a challenge I'd like to put on jurisdictions, is to try and figure out, how do you share resources better? Because a major problem, I think, in Spokane is we don't have a traffic department. We have a streets department, we have a planning department. And so it turns into a game of the planning department would basically have to ask the streets department or the parks department to borrow their materials. And the integration seems like it could use a little work.
Yeah, and I can just kind of point, I'm born and raised in Portland and have been in Seattle for some time now. I think one of the interesting things I will say about Portland's DOT specifically is their willingness to try something, to take a cement garbage can and fill it with dirt and put it in the road and call it a diverter, for example, is, I think, a little bit unique. I will say, funding issues come up in Seattle, and we have quite a bit of funding. And for frequent frustrations I have are things like spending, hundreds of thousands of dollars on what looks like low cost installs, when I'm just like, can we not have done something cheap? Is there no, why? Why are we paying $700 for a bending plastic stick in the road? Is there really nothing we could try that's cheaper than that? And I will say that I think somebody put in the chat, which is that city staff can be afraid of transitional infrastructure. I think getting over those hurdles would be really important, because piloting projects seems to be a good way to try something, to show the community it can be taken out if it's bad. But a lot of the times they work, and they work okay, and people like them if they can see them. And so finding ways to do things cheaply, I think sometimes in our group, we like to say the phrase tactical urbanism, go fill up a flower pot and like put it here and see if it works out or whatever, can be great things groups can do on their own. But it's something that I think we need to encourage more departments of transportation to say, not everything has to be gold plated. Just figure it out and put it down on the street, and we will adapt around it a little bit here. And in the long run, we can develop a longer range vision if people like it. I
have a question about like that resistance. Is it is it the engineers? Who is the audience that we need to reach? Are they citing, one of those jargony manuals? How can I help change that resistance as a national organization for you?
I guess from my experience, it's needing to meet metrics. And so, putting in a pilot project bike lane when we have a transportation levy that said it was going to deliver 15 miles of bike lanes, but does the pilot project count? I think it's those kinds of hurdles. And I know that Canada has, I think Calgary in particular stands out as a city that did pilot a basic bike network. And I don't know whether liability plays in. I don't understand why everything is so expensive in this country. Because even I think in Seattle, even what is viewed as a not temporary but an initial install of a flex post is apparently, according to Robert, $700. And I think the goal there is that over time that infrastructure will be improved, but with more solid protection. But it's still expensive, and it's still quote unquote permanent, except it's not, because they get hit.
Yeah, I would say similarly. I mean, the resistance I've seen, I think Jessica expresses one, which is a difference between people who plan and people who build. Planners, I think, sometimes are a little more soft on those things, but then the builders are like, well, my technical manual says we should put a flex post every 6 feet this wide and right here, and a flower pot isn't in here, So I think that there's some resistance also with just interdepartmental issues of planners having lofty ideas and then the engineers being like, no.
Okay, so it's 4:52. I would love to just keep asking you questions. I think we have a couple of audience questions that I want to go over to. One is around it's a very specific question. What is your relationship with fire departments? The fire department can sometimes be an impediment to safety projects. Anyone got any thoughts there?
I think this is a great question. I don't have a great answer, so I'll be quick. I have not really interacted with the Spokane Fire Department much, but it is definitely on my to-do list to get a relationship and a communication going with them. I have heard rumors of the fire department being opposed to certain traffic calming treatments, but I've also heard that there were situations where people use them as an excuse, and when they actually tried to call the fire department and say, see, tell them you can't do this treatment, the fire department's like, we have no problem with it. I don't, so, but absolutely, that is, that can be huge, because that is the difference between being able to put in a 10-foot driving lane versus an 11-foot driving lane, which, as we all know, could be, 10 miles per hour in speed, which is easily the difference between whether a vulnerable road user lives or dies in the case of a collision.
Thanks, Jessica. I chimed in on the chat, but just our organization was founded actually by a firefighter with support of the fire department. And I will say they, along with Trauma Nurses Talk Tough, Kaiser Permanente, Peace Health, have all partnered to mainly, if you want to do a helmet drive or things of that, to get your organization word out to the community by donating helmets. You put a sticker on your organization and free helmets to kids, and so food for thought.
Yeah, in Seattle Fire Department has generally been a decent partner in projects. I know the city has a strong relationship with making sure that they approve of where things go and what types of treatment are used. I think one thing that also helps is, at least in our group, I have a strong awareness of, I actually have a map that shows me the primary and secondary fire routes for the area. So if an arterial is blocked, where does that fire truck go? It's apparently already planned out. So if you can get into that information or encourage your city to have that, that can be really vital. Because if you know, okay, this specific road is being used for emergency access, we can maybe go on the block up, block below, or something like that. I will say that I think some of it is also the value proposition. You know, fire department wants to get to their call fast. So, you know, they might see a speed hump as potentially detrimental to that. But the thing that I think is important to key in with your departments of transportation and even conversations with the fire department is that one of the things that they most frequently respond to are severe collisions and other collisions, and trying to reduce the number of calls that they need to go out on is helpful in improving, you know, getting things better overall for people. The other thing, you know, and I don't really know how to start this conversation, is American fire trucks are too big. I come from a family of firefighters who will probably be very upset that I just said that, because they all love their fire trucks, very much so, but they are too big. They are the size of a bus, and they do not need to be the size of a bus. And I don't know how we open that door a little more broadly, because it's expensive equipment. But there is quite a bit of information that would indicate that we could move to smaller equipment that may better suit certain conditions. Maybe how I'll say that.
Robert, I hope your entire family is watching this. Maybe they can. You can all watch the recording together. Okay, so I guess we have just a few minutes, and so I want to wrap up with this, circling back to the very beginning. And number one, bike-friendly state. I guess a question I have for everyone is, what does that mean to you? I guess I'll say, I think for me, and for my work, I think it's really for the league scoring that says, like, this is what a bike-friendly state looks like. These are the policies that they have. I think it's that is the most important thing for us. That is like, oh, this is a really helpful sort of set of guideposts of the direction we should be going in. Yeah, but does being number one bike-friendly state have any connection to your work? And what does it mean?
I would say for me, Washington always being the number one bicycle friendly state is that we look to Washington to be a leader. We want to see Washington state pushing the boundaries of what a state can do as a DOT, as a governor, as a legislature to make things better for biking. It was great to see Washington get a stop as yield rule or yield stop rule this year. Really exciting that 5 states now have that. Seeing that kind of innovation, that kind of push is exactly what I want to see from the number one bicycle friendly state. And I'm going to add to my question. Is something, just because I saw Robert's face, would something like that is like, these are the policies for a bike friendly community at the local level, would that be helpful in your work?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the challenge is right. We live in Washington. It's a progressive-ish state, and I live in Seattle. I live in theoretically the progressive center of this state. And I think for me, what really we have to start seeing is policy and initiative with teeth. And so I'm really proud of the stature that we're at, the funding that we do, and the projects that we have. But I think in the long run, the biggest struggle is that still every individual project, every individual construction is a debatable argument. It is controversial. It is something that is considered optional. And for the large part, it is. Even in the city of Seattle, where we have probably more rules than most other regions in the state about where you're supposed to build a bike lane and all the things that say you have to do it, just don't when they don't want to, and they'll come up with a way around it. And so for me, I think while it's great that we are really moving in the right direction and we are saying all the right things, at the end of the day, we still are struggling, I think, a lot on the teeth of our policies and making sure that they are enforceable, and that the question is, how should we design a way for bikes to move through your corridor, and not, should we even have those? Like, do we need them? What about this parking space? And, you know, that's not just to quickly note, that's not to disparage bike parking or anything, but it's just to say that when we have trade-offs, particularly, you know, we have to evaluate them fairly in what we're doing. So sorry, I do want to give time for Jessica to at the end.
Just really quickly, excellent points, Robert. A slight tangent, but yes, we're the #1 bike state, friendly state. We're all cyclists, or most of our cyclists. We know that. But I wonder how many of our city council members know that, or how many of our engineers and planners know that, how that information is getting out or distributed, into the communities out there. And maybe other people have other thoughts to chime in on the chat.
Speaking of the chat, on the previous topic of fire trucks and departments, I dropped a link to a webinar. It's a few years old, but it was with the Portland Fire Bureau chief. And I think it actually addresses a lot of the questions that Robert raised. So yeah, definitely copy paste that link before the chat window disappears. As far as what it means to be the #1 biking state, I think a good chunk of it is WSDOT. Having been in Portland previously, it's night and day comparing ODOT to WSDOT, and in a good way for Washington, and in a very unfortunate way for Oregon. I'm sure that you folks in Vancouver are familiar with the differences there, but so I think that's really big. But other than that, a lot of what makes biking good in Spokane has nothing to do with what the city or the state has done. It's a lot of, we have good bones. We have a street grid. We have, a lot of areas of the city are very flat. A lot of the areas of the city are very poor. So people are biking because they have to. And these are all elements of a good biking city that are extremely important. But it's not like I can proudly say, oh yes, we're a great biking city because our local government or state government or metro government make it so. It's almost more of a coincidence that it works out that way. Which I don't mean to end on a bit of a downer statement, but I do think it is important for us to understand what of our positive traits are things that we have done ourselves versus just, coincidentally or lucking into, and what of our negative traits or challenges are things that are, beds that we have made versus just circumstances. So I think about that a lot when I think about Washington being the #1 state for biking, but I also think, as somebody who used to live abroad, I used to live in Japan, and when I was living in Kyoto, Japan in particular, biking is a very common form of transportation there because the tourists clog up the bus system, and it's too dense to really be able to drive comfortably a lot of times, but it's also not dense enough to be able to walk everywhere. So compared to Kyoto, for example, I don't know that there's really a single city in the United States that compares in terms of, bikeability. And again, that's not because they have a lot of infrastructure, it's because they have so many people biking that all of the drivers know to look for people biking. Almost everybody in the city has biked at one point in time, or they have a family member who bikes. Maybe dad takes the train to work, and mom bikes to the grocery store, and their kid walks to school. And it's a very multimodal community in a way that it's not in the United States. So I do wonder a lot about that scale. I've never lived in some of the bottom states, so I don't know how bad it gets. Maybe I'm just spoiled in that regard, but yeah.
I'll chime in and say, and I want to credit Tom Fucalora at the Seattle Bike Blog for pointing this out, that maybe being the #1 bike friendly state doesn't say much about Washington State. It just says a lot about like the rest of the country, right? It's like that as a country, like biking is not particularly safe and particularly valued in terms of policies and funding. And so we're the top of a pack that is not a great pack. Okay, so that took us in a really pessimistic direction. But simultaneously, I do want to respect people's time. Say that again, Jessica.
I said, but we are still #1.
We're still #1.
Not all bad.
Okay.
And then a note of everybody says maybe their favorite project or something like that, something positive. Then maybe quickly.
Okay. Next bike ride that you're really excited about.
Ooh, Well, for me, I'm high risk with COVID, so I haven't been planning anything too exciting. So just getting out there
Trip
and
to the
being
store?
outside is fun. So my next enjoyable bike ride will just be probably to the park. It'll be, I'm excited about it still.
One of
I'm gonna
our
bike home. Oh, go ahead.
no, you go first.
Oh, I was just gonna say my next bike ride is to bike home after this meeting.
So the Shacktown Community Bike Center which is I don't know if it's officially a not-for-profit, but it should be, bike shop in downtown Spokane, has been holding Thursday night rides all summer. And for anyone who's done Thursday night ride in Portland, same vibe, different scale, but it's a lot of fun. And yeah, the second I hop off of this, I'm going to grab a bite to eat and then run downtown to participate in what's probably the last good weather Thursday night ride for quite some time.
Ken, do you bike?
I bike. I think if the weather is good, I'll be biking myself to election officer training this Saturday. So hopefully I don't have to take the car, and hopefully I'll bike there, and excited to be an election officer this season.
That's awesome. I haven't biked in a few months, but I'm excited to get my kiddie bike trailer out and get my kid back in the trailer for a few more rides before the weather turns really bad. Robert, thank you for making us have one more question. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you. I hope that you have too, obviously, and that everyone else who tuned in did. And yeah, just thank you for being here, and thank you for really the work that you're doing to make your communities safer for people who walk, bike, and roll. And I think that we're going to post in the chat for all the attendees a feedback form. So please let us know what you loved, what you didn't. And with that, thank you and be free. Oh, and there is a networking thing at 5:30 that is a bit of a free-formed thing that you should join for a free-form chat to either follow on this conversation or have a totally different conversation, but probably about bikes. Okay, thank you all. You're free.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Vicky.
Bye.